All right. Hi, Lauren. Welcome to the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast. I'm so excited to have you on today.
So excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So you have your own story with health, and you are such a wealth of information with all things CGM and metabolism and glucose. So I'm really excited to dive in. But can you start us off with your personal health journey?
Absolutely. So I was in my early mid-20s. I was actually in medical school at the time and very into running, had always had a lean BMI, really thought that I was doing almost everything I could for my health, and even thought I was eating really well. I had a sweet tooth. I really loved chocolate, but most of the time I felt like I was eating really well. And knowing that diabetes runs in my family, I had some testing. I had the oral glucose tolerance test as a screen, just knowing that there might be a tendency towards that due to my family background. And to my surprise, I was diagnosed with prediabetes. And this is kind of interesting because from that point forward, I was really on my own journey to understand blood sugar. And at the same time was studying medicine in order to help other people understand their health. And it was kind of this bizarre dichotomy because I was learning all this information, but I wasn't actually learning about nutrition or about a systems-based approach to the human body. And so I was kind of doing two parallel educations, the traditional education and then my own journey into understanding my own body. And as part of that, I learned all about glycemic index and I started trying to understand how to take control. But as many people have probably experienced, it's very hard to find the information that you're looking for and then to know how to tailor that to your body. And at some point, I realized that I needed to know what was going on with my blood sugar through some kind of metric. So I thought about finger pricking, and I was really interested in finding a continuous glucose monitor. But again, as many people have probably experienced, if you ask traditional physicians for access to a CGM, it's very, very hard to get one. And I kept getting responses like, well, maybe your testing suggests you have prediabetes, but look at you. It's not really a problem. If it was a problem, you would look different. And that was something that I kind of found throughout my experience with the traditional healthcare system. And it's not a criticism. I think it's how physicians are trained. It's how I was being trained, which is that we have these heuristics for trying to understand what someone's risk actually is. And when someone doesn't fit that, we kind of assume that the puzzle doesn't make sense for some reason. And I think that's one of the things that I love now working blood sugar is helping to share the information that your body can look any way and you can be having metabolic dysfunction. And at this point, 9 out of 10 Americans have that. So I was certainly in that category and found my way over many years to experimenting with tons of different diet modifications, exercise modifications, and ultimately ended up in a coffee shop with Sam, who is one of the co-founders of Levels, which is combining biosensors like CGMs with apps and software based insights in order to help people understand how food affects their health. And one thing led to another. And next thing I knew, I was using Levels myself. I finally had that window into my body. And I had also joined the team and have been there ever since.
And so you were able to reverse your prediabetes, I assume.
Yes. Yeah. And it was kind of amazing because I had been inching towards it, I think, through all the things that I had been trying. But due to all of the confusion, again, this was at this point, I had graduated from medical school. I had an MD and I still couldn't figure out exactly fully how to optimize my own blood sugar because it's so personalized, it's so individualized. And I think a lot of the marketing out there is just really, really confusing and oftentimes intentionally misleading. So I was doing things like starting my morning with oatmeal, which was recommended to me so many times. And then I had even tried to modify from there to say, well, the lower glycemic version of that is steel cut oats. So I'm doing that, right? And I had done all these things, but when I put on a continuous glucose monitor for the first time, what I discovered is that my blood sugar was spiking all the time from things that I had no idea would spike it, including in some cases, actually healthy, nutritious foods like entire plates of vegetables. But on that plate was sweet potato and beets and other starchy vegetables that were spiking me out. And so it was really, really life-changing to see that information and pair that with everything I had been trying to understand from a more textbook or academic standpoint.
I love everything you're saying, and I'm really excited to dive into that personalization aspect, which is why I think CGMs are so powerful and honestly the best. I feel they are the best investment you can make in your health, because they are just that window into what is happening in your body. And that personalization factor is so important. But I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier. And I wanted to ask, why in your personal opinion, do you think that it's so hard to get continuous glucose monitors? Why do you think doctors are, in addition to what you already mentioned, that they have this paradigm where they're like, oh, you don't fit this picture of what, someone who's very sick looks like. But what about for prevention? Why are doctors not prescribing these? Why are they not making exceptions for clients who are coming in with significant blood sugar dysregulation symptoms? Why don't they see this as a very valuable tool for prevention and reversal of issues? Why do you think that is?
This is such a complex question. I think there's so many potential answers. I mean, I think one of them is that the traditional healthcare education focuses really on being reactive to problems that already exist rather than preventative. And there's been so much dialogue now about the importance of preventative medicine, but I think it will take many, many years for that to be truly integrated into practice. And this is for so many reasons, including the fact that many of our, quote, solutions are drugs and other interventions that are meant to treat something that we have now have already diagnosed. So we don't have as much focus on things before they're diagnosed, which is a problem. When it comes to blood sugar specifically, I think there's actually a misunderstanding amongst a lot of the medical community. And this is with full respect to my physician colleagues, because I have so much respect for them. But I think that we have created a mindset around blood sugar that doesn't really reflect the physiology that's happening. So specifically, we have created cutoffs, for example, around blood testing. Most people who are seeing their primary care physician will have a fasting blood sugar done. And they'll be told either it's normal or it's pre-diabetic or it's diabetic. And there's these cutoffs. But the reality is, of course, that blood sugar health and metabolic health is on a spectrum. It's a range. And so, for example, the cutoff for prediabetes is 99 or below is normal. But so if you have a 98, you're normal. And if you have 101, you have prediabetes. That makes absolutely no sense. And so actually what often is happening is you're seeing people's fasting glucose numbers inch up year by year. But as long as they're under that threshold, they're being told they're fine. And this is often, despite the fact that, like you said, they're having a lot of symptoms that don't feel normal to them, right? They're coming to the doctor's office, maybe saying my energy just isn't there, or I'm gaining weight and I don't really understand why. It doesn't seem to make sense. My sleep is interrupted. I'm having mood swings or depression or anxiety. And I think the answer that people often get in response is, well, your blood sugar is fine. So that is not a thing. Don't worry about that. And actually what that means is then those people often are unintentionally given the recommendation to continue doing what they're doing, which is actually creating the problem. And so what we now know is that people have symptoms of insulin resistance and physiologic signs of insulin resistance over 10 years before they have a prediabetes diagnosis. And that's a huge window of opportunity in which anyone can intervene, but it's not being recognized by the healthcare system and by the physicians that they're seeing. And so this is one of the things that's most important to me, is just helping physicians understand that the blood tests that we're using, first of all, are not the best markers of metabolic health. And in addition to that, that we need to view them as interesting trends and patterns rather than cliffs or cutoffs, which really doesn't reflect physiology.
I love everything you said. And it does, these cutoffs lead to, that physicians are trained with. They lead to what ends up being this medical gaslighting. And they say, well, it must not be your blood sugar because it's fine. And that's how they were trained, right? So it's not the individuals themselves, but it's like this whole system and the fact that, they need a billing code, right, in order to bill insurance to be able to provide certain things. So it is so complex. And I think that the information just is not being updated in that mainstream conventional medical model fast enough. And so this is where, companies like Levels are really helping. Are you guys, do you have any sort of initiatives to inform physicians? Like, is that part of your, what you guys do in your company? Because I would love if it were.
We spend a lot of time doing what I think of almost as metabolic health advocacy and awareness, including a lot of collaborations with physicians and academic researchers, and really just getting the word out. For example, doing podcasts like these, doing tons and tons of blog articles and content that's available to anyone, and just trying to really spark the dialogue, both in households and in kind of day-to-day conversations amongst people, but also in the academic communities. Because I think one of the things that's interesting about this is we're talking about physicians missing blood sugar or metabolic dysfunction in their patients. We know more than 9 out of 10 Americans have some marker of metabolic dysfunction, which means almost definitionally, those very same physicians themselves are experiencing metabolic dysfunction and are missing it in themselves. So this is really something that implicates all of us. And I don't think it's that physicians know that their patients have it and then are saying, well, I'm just not going to focus on that. I really think it's just not known yet. This is just now kind of coming into more of the more conventional conversation, which is exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. And it's good to hear that there are some, there is some progress. And I do think that it's sort of like this grassroots movement, like the consumer being informed that, oh, there are these issues. And I bought a CGM and I didn't need my doctor for it. And I learned all this stuff about my metabolic health, and taking that information into your doctor and informing them. So then there could be that ripple effect. And of course, some doctors are not going to be open to it. It really is probably on a, more personal level, whether that person might go in and study. Sometimes, I had someone in my group coaching, and her husband had a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, and she started cooking all his meals when she started the program, and his A1C went from like a 7 to like a 5.2 and in just that 8-week duration. And it was, I guess, I don't know how it changed that quickly, but it was about 2 months. So yeah, huge change. And I asked her, what did the doctor say? Did he say, tell me every single thing you did so I can tell my other patients? Or was it just like, oh, great, keep doing what you're doing? So, anyway, I don't want to, be cutting down physicians. That's not what the point of this is, but it is to sort of highlight, on the other hand, how important it is to do your own advocacy and have that your own knowledge of all of this stuff. And that's sort of what sparked me to get started in this, is because I had PCOS and I had hypoglycemia. My blood sugar was 60 multiple times. When I went in to do blood work that year, I was dizzy, I was lightheaded, I was shaky. I was someone who was grazing and snacking all day to sort of self-medicate, keep my blood sugar up. I also identified heavily with that sweet tooth. I used to say, all my teeth are sweet. And so I was very missed. I would go in, I have PCOS, what's happening? No one said anything about my blood sugar. Meanwhile, I was about to pass out, but I just thought that's because I was a breakfast person, right? So there's so little known even about, we talk about diabetes awareness. There's so little known about the symptoms of diabetes, and much less known about these early symptoms of blood sugar dysregulation and metabolic dysfunction. So can you tell us more a little bit about what is metabolic health, and how do we know, like, what does it look like when it's working optimally, and what happens when it starts to get a little bit off? Maybe we should start there.
Sounds good. So metabolic health is really just describing the body's process of turning the food we eat into energy. We have about 37 trillion cells, and every cell needs energy to do its function optimally. So there's tons of biochemical processes happening within the body at any given moment. When all of those processes are happening smoothly, that's called good metabolic health. Unfortunately, mostly due to lifestyle factors like eating diets very high in sugar or high in processed foods, those processes are often disrupted. And that's where we get into metabolic dysfunction. Like you said, many of the symptoms in the day-to-day, things like energy crashes, mood swings, interrupted sleep, weight gain, skin issues, infertility, ultimately, these things, I think often we've actually normalized as being normal. For example, I think it's considered relatively normal for Americans to eat lunch and then have a complete crash and feel like they could fall asleep on the floor. So a lot of these things, it's also about recognizing that actually this doesn't have to be our normal, and that maybe those are flags that something is going on. And almost all of those can be tied to blood sugar. And then, of course, in the long term, blood sugar is connected with 9 out of the 10 leading causes of death in the US. So there's a very serious long-term consequence of metabolic dysfunction and blood sugar dysregulation. It's linked to dementia and Alzheimer's. It's linked to heart disease. It's linked to, of course, diabetes. Like I said, PCOS and infertility, as you know, not a cause of death, but certainly a really serious and kind of life-interrupting condition for many women. and very common, 1 in 4 women. So this is not a rare thing. So really, blood sugar, I think, underlies almost every aspect of our bodies. And it's really exciting, like you said, that it's finally getting discussed more and recognized more, because one of the reasons I'm so excited about it is because of what you said, which is actually we have the power to reverse it. And we have much, much more of the power than doctors do. And ultimately, I think the efforts of people like you and the work that we're trying to do at Levels is to allow every person to become their own doctor. Because, well, for one, it's the day-to-day moment choices that create metabolic health. But also, we only have access to doctors for most of us, say 15, 20 minutes a year in some cases for your primary care visit. It's just not nearly enough time. And so the more that we can become independent of that and become the drivers of our own health, I think the more opportunity we have.
I agree. I don't think that our doctors, we should consider them as the keeper of our health and the gateway to our health. We can utilize doctors for what they're good at. We can get lab work, we can look into this stuff. And, if we need prescription drugs, that's where I feel like they might fall in. But other than that, this is in our own hands. And a CGM, like we said, is really such an incredible tool. So can you tell us why this continuous glucose monitor, or CGM, just some of the benefits of having it? Like, why would someone want to use a CGM?
So the CGM shows you in real time what is happening to your blood sugar as you go throughout your day. So this is the first time really that people have a way of seeing how the food that they're eating literally impacts their blood sugar in real time. It's really incredible to have that closed loop feedback. You think about things like, for example, even weight. Often with weight, it's a very long feedback cycle. You're eating, you're making all these changes, you're doing all these things, and maybe you're hoping to see a change on the scale over the course of weeks or months. And that's great. That's the normal process of weight management. But there's something really empowering about seeing something in the moment to moment and being able to say, okay, I made this choice, and either, wow, it really spiked my blood sugar, and actually it didn't feel that good in my body either. And now I know that might not work for me. Or, wow, I did this thing differently, or I made this choice and I feel great. And my blood sugar is stable. Okay, like this is something that I might want to rely on again. So I think cutting through the confusion and the guesswork that happens when you don't have that kind of feedback is really empowering. And rather than creating restriction, it actually creates a lot of freedom, because now every time you're eating something, it's an opportunity to learn. And then you can take those learnings and apply them to all aspects of your decision making. And at Levels, we're focused mostly on food, but the CGM will actually also show you what happens when you work out. There's blood sugar changes depending on the intensity of exercise, for example, right? What happens when you don't get a good night of sleep? How does that impact your blood sugar? What happens when you're stressed? This is one that I think we really underestimate the impact of. I saw an amazing example of the impact of stress in one of my close friends who was wearing the CGM and had a fight with her partner and was really upset. And her blood sugar spiked so high, higher than any food caused her to spike in the past. And it was just, and then when they resolved it, it came back down again. It was such an incredible reflection of how complex and amazing the body is, and how everything that we do in our lives and how we live our lives impacts our metabolic health.
Yeah, that is so well said. And I completely agree with all these factors. I love helping my clients when they have these CGMs on, when they start to, I encourage them to start connecting what your blood sugar is doing, not necessarily the exact number, but oftentimes it's going to be a pattern. So is it falling quickly? Did it rise sharply? Is it staying elevated? So these kind of things, connecting those things with our symptoms. All of a sudden, it's like, oh my goodness, I noticed that this came from a client at the very top of the peak of the spike for my blood glucose. That's when I started to get headaches. Or I noticed that as my blood sugar is coming down and it dips below, the starting point, that I start to get anxious, I start to get hangry, I start to have cravings. And I notice if my blood sugar gets below this certain point, I feel this way. So this is one of the many things that CGMs can do. And then you also talked about that personalization part. So this was an example that I just saw on Instagram. Someone tested white rice versus quinoa, right? And to me, I thought white rice or brown rice was gonna spike it higher, and the quinoa actually spiked it higher. So but just even seeing for an individual person, what carbohydrates you might do better with. So I know someone who says that cassava, which is, a grain-free substitute that's often used in like healthy paleo type foods and things, that cassava spikes them like crazy, whereas they do much better with things like fruits or, white rice or something. So learning these different things about yourself, oftentimes we can have the exact same grams of carbohydrates and fiber in a food, and one might spike us like crazy, and the other one we might do a little bit better with. We might not have these cravings. So that's where this like much deeper personalization also comes in, because we can have reactions to foods that are sort of unexpected from what the nutrition label is saying. So one of the things that I've been noticing with those sort of unexpected spikes is that I feel that there's oftentimes, if someone might be sensitive to a food in some way, that there is a concomitant cortisol spike that is also driving up blood sugar even more. So I feel that perhaps some of these sort of anomalies may come from a sensitivity. Do you know of anything? Do you have any insight into that? Or
I'm not familiar with research on essentially allergic reactions or kind of adverse food reactions and blood sugar spikes, but I do think that there is a lot of evidence pointing to the impact of microbiome and gut physiology in general in relation to metabolic health. And I think we're going to see that research emerging more and more. It does make sense, though, that if your body thinks that essentially there's an invasion of some kind, right? Maybe that's a food that your body doesn't tolerate, an intolerance. It makes sense that your body would mount a stress response, and that part of that stress response might be to increase your blood sugar. I think that's very possible. And these are, like you said, among the kind of interesting personal experiments you can do as you're exploring this. And I would even add to that, on top of these types of things, which are maybe consistent day to day in terms of you always have a reaction or an intolerance to a certain food. Also, did you get a good night's sleep? Or if you're a reproductive age woman, how are your hormones cycling? Or are you more stressed today than you were yesterday? All these things can take the same meal that you ate one day and change it for the next day. So it's incredibly fascinating.
I love that. And you're bringing up these great points about how, in addition to food, things like sleep, stress, movement, and exercise are some of the biggest factors in impacting our blood sugar. So we can eat this, and also time of day, right? So we can eat the same exact food, either, for breakfast and dinner, and have a different glucose response. We can eat the same exact meal one day at 8 a.m. after a good night of sleep versus a poor night of sleep, and we're going to see different responses. So can you talk to us? You said that the acute stressor caused a big spike. So can we go into like sleep, movement, and stress and talk about how those things, like what they do to blood sugar?
Absolutely. We'll take them one by one. So if
Sure.
we start with movement, I love movement because, first of all, I think it's accessible to everybody in some form, just about everybody. And also it has a dramatic impact on blood sugar, and any amount is helpful. So I think people sometimes have this conception that they need to do this hard workout. Actually, there's been some interesting research showing that little movement throughout the day, for example, there was a study looking at, I think it was 2 minutes of light movement every 20 minutes. You might have seen that study. That has immense impacts on health. And that's something that we can all do by literally standing up, walking to the kitchen, and walking back. So I think, to me, the power of exercise is just almost unparalleled in terms of tools we have. People are often asking, like, when is the miracle pill going to come out for this or that? Movement is a miracle pill. And I think
I fully agree.
Right. And that doesn't mean it's easy to do. I think we all have days where we're like, wow, I really would rather not move today. And some days that's okay. But I think knowing that if someone prescribed this to us as a pill, we would do it. It helps me keep in my mind how important it is. And for metabolic health, strength training, I think, is really special, because not only do the muscles use glucose when you're doing the strength training, but it also is an investment in the future of your metabolic health, because the more lean muscle you have, the more that those muscles are going to continue soaking up blood sugar in everything that you do throughout your day. So exercise is really incredible. And I think there's a lot of interesting work being done on specifically how to optimize it. But for me, what I tell like all my family members and friends is just anything that you do that's moving, that's a success in my book. And Once you get to a point where you want to optimize, great, you can dive in there. But for most everybody, just doing more than we're doing is a huge step forward. So that's exercise. Sleep is amazing. I think there's so much evidence now that high quality sleep sets you up for a much easier time managing your blood sugar. When you don't get good sleep, it creates an inflammatory state, and it really triggers a stress response that's connected to cortisol and to all kinds of other activating hormones that suggest to your body that things are not calm and normal, that actually things are activated and inflamed. And what you see in blood sugar data and CGM data is that when people have even one night of poor sleep, their blood sugar is much more out of control the next day, even if they do everything else the same. So I think many clinicians actually who are in the metabolic health space focus on sleep quality as one of the absolute most important things, simply because no matter what you do, if you're really sleep deprived, it's going to be very difficult. And then we talked some about diet. We can dive into that more, but there's so much on diet. That's of course one of the primary levers. And then stress. Stress is really, really underestimated in terms of the impact. We've often noticed at levels, even for example, if someone's giving a presentation to the company and then they look at their CGM data, their blood sugar rose during that time, because when we're stressed, our body says, okay, we're kind of moving into fight or flight mode. If an animal were to come and we needed to fight or flee, we would need blood sugar in our system to be able to do that. And so it mounts that response and you can see that blood sugar rise. The problem is that there actually is no animal. And so we actually don't fight or flee. And so we don't actually burn that blood sugar off. We're just in this state of increasing it. And I think this is both acute stressors. So for example, you have a fight with your partner, you get a big spike, but it's also underlying chronic stress all the time, where our bodies are always just in that state of kind of arousal in terms of the stress response in the body. And there's all kinds of amazing research being done on the impacts of high levels of blood sugar on the brain, and specifically the areas related to motivation, reward, memory, learning. And so it's proposed that this is among the reasons why there actually is a link, for example, between insulin resistance and depression, insulin resistance and anxiety. And I think most of it, the theme around it is your body being in a stressed framework, let's say, or kind of place of stasis. And then on top of that, having the long-term impacts of never having that insulin come down.
Yeah, love that. That's really helpful to hear. And it's crazy how much our glucose levels and insulin levels really impact our brain. Sort of, I feel like maybe almost the most out of any organ in our body, right? And maybe the blood vessels and the brain sort of primarily. And it's, oftentimes those brain symptoms where the brain is not getting enough energy, those are the first symptoms to show up. So, and then we know that there's, like you said, that there's a really strong link between our metabolic health and our cognitive health. So Alzheimer's and things, they're very tied together. So we talked about a little bit about diet, not much. Maybe we can circle back to that. We talked about stress, sleep, movement, and you also mentioned the microbiome. So I'd like to also talk about how that is sort of, I know we don't have full amount of research yet, but any information that we do have about how it is linked to our blood sugar levels.
This is a very emerging area. So I think one of the things that reflects it that we've noticed at levels is the way that two people can eat the same food, for example, beans, and one person gets a huge response out of it and one person doesn't. So that suggests something is going on. And then what makes it even more interesting is if the person who gets a big response, which is say a blood sugar spike out of beans, it looks like there are actually ways to change that response. For example, by eating more and more fiber over a course of weeks or a couple months, and essentially this is the theory, changing the microbiome through the increased fiber intake. And for example, by increasing the amount of beans they're eating, which is causing the gut to respond by having a microbiome that can process beans. There have actually been examples of people who then do not respond with blood sugar spikes to beans after a period of changing their diet. So I don't think that means we know that the microbiome is the cause of this, but it certainly suggests that there's something happening that is modifiable, and that two people start off differently, but that an individual could modify over time. There's also some really interesting work happening in looking at probiotics as an intervention for blood sugar control. I think this is very new. It's kind of come onto the scene in the last couple of months in terms of a lot of conversation about that. And again, I think very, very emerging, but my guess is a year from now, if we have another conversation, there will be a lot of information that has come out about the impacts of this. And I think my approach to it is, and I know this is our levels approach too, is even without knowing all the details, we all try to do things that make our microbiomes as healthy as possible. So for example, eating a large diversity of plants, eating lots of foods that are fermented, all of those things, because it's very clear that having a healthy microbiome is helpful. It's just that the details haven't been filled in yet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm excited to see more research come out in this area because I feel like it's pretty untapped. So are there any other factors that people tend to miss when it comes to what is impacting their metabolic health and their blood sugar levels? A lot of people think it's just diet. And then maybe they're like, oh yeah, if I don't sleep well, oh yeah, I haven't, exercised in a year. Oh yeah, my stress is crazy. Okay, my gut. So we're starting to build this list of the factors that are impacting our blood sugar levels. It's not just what we eat. So is there anything else in there that you feel is noteworthy?
Hormonal balance. And I think often this is chicken and egg in the sense that they're all interacting with each other. So, but especially for women who are having menstrual cycles, there's some really interesting insights that have started to come out around the impact of different phases of the menstrual cycle and insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity. And so without getting too deep into the details, essentially, if you just broadly break the cycle into two halves, the first half being, say, days 1 through 14, so pre-ovulation, then the second half being post-ovulation, days 14 through 28. It looks like in the first part of the cycle after menstruation, so approximately after day 5, this is assuming a typical 28-day cycle, knowing that, of course, there's variety in how long any given woman's cycle is. But after menstruation ends, you go into the follicular period when you're developing the follicle or the egg that will eventually be released for potential fertilization. During that time period, estrogen is the dominant signal. And estrogen is associated with insulin sensitivity. So many women find that actually they're more tolerant to carbs or even sugar, let's hopefully natural sugar, during that time. And that also, as they approach ovulation and estrogen is peaking, and actually testosterone is also peaking, because although we associate testosterone as a male hormone, it's actually the most predominant hormone in the female body, and we're exquisitely sensitive to it. So you get this peak in estrogen and testosterone as you lead up to ovulation. And many women find that window is a window of opportunity for creating some physiologic stress. For example, doing a hard workout or going for strength gains in their strength training, or maybe experimenting with intermittent fasting if that's something that they're doing. After ovulation, progesterone increases and becomes the dominant signal. And progesterone is actually associated with insulin resistance. So this is a period when we would expect to see women having a little bit of a harder time managing blood sugar. And also, as I think many women have experienced, carb cravings tend to increase during that time as you get towards the end of the luteal phase. So, I think there's this bizarre paradox where we become more driven to eat carbs, but our bodies also become less resilient to them. And there was actually a study observing women as they move into the later part of the cycle. And women on average in the study ate 260% more refined carbs than they did at the other times of the cycle. So it is very real, the kind of change in cravings. And so I think many women will find that is not probably a time when it's going to be easy to physiologically stress the body. For example, trying to do intermittent fasting on day 23 is probably going to be significantly harder than on day 9. And so I think there's both just awareness of this so that women can say, okay, I'm noticing something feels different, or I'm seeing different data on my CGM. Maybe it's hormonal. I think even just having that awareness is helpful. And then also just having some compassion and advanced warning for strategizing. So like for me, I know, okay, well, maybe if I'm going to crave carbs during that time, what are things I can do to help myself with that? For example, try to get really high quality sleep during that time, or try to have things around the house that kind of satisfy that carb craving, but don't jack up my blood sugar. These things that I know will make me feel my best. So I think that's an often under discussed area, in part because the vast majority of metabolic health research has been done on men. And as we were chatting about before we started recording, unfortunately, I think there's been this assumption that up until really very recently, actually say the last 10 to 20 years, that research that was done on men should just apply to women because women are just smaller men with breasts. And of course, we know that that is not true. And that's not true for women of reproductive age. And it's not true for women after reproductive age, or really at any chapter in their lives. Women are very different than men. So again, this is another area where we need a lot more research. I hope it will happen, but there's already some interesting insights that I think people can use to their advantage.
That's really great information and really helpful, because I noticed that a lot of people say that, my blood sugar is going crazy. It's the week before my cycle. All of a sudden I'm having cravings. My appetite increases. Our basal metabolic rate does go up. So we do need more food. And, so it's important. We're not trying to restrict at that point. We want to nourish our body and give it lots of healthy food, lots of healthy proteins and fats. And, non-starchy vegetables could be a really great start to really balance that plate and get your body the nutrients it needs, because perhaps that could sort of quell some of those additional cravings. But really important factors to consider when we want to dial up low carb and fasting, and when we want to sort of ease out of that fasting and things like that to promote better overall hormonal balance. So really great insight there. And so another thing that is really interesting to me is that I'm learning that there's these studies showing that it is worse to have very high glycemic variability, so having these big blood sugar spikes and crashes, than it is to even have sort of stable higher level blood sugar. And the reason for this being these reactive oxygen species and a high level of oxidative stress in the body. So we find that these blood sugar spikes really drive oxidative stress in the body. Can you tell us how oxidative stress is harming the body, like what that means and how it sort of relates?
I'll give an example that I think applies to all of the body systems, and that's skin health. As you're describing, when blood sugar is high, sugar likes to stick to everything around it. So when blood sugar is high, sugar is actually sticking to blood vessel walls. It's sticking to basically everything it comes into contact with, including collagen in the case of skin. And as I think many people can visualize, collagen typically makes up this really beautiful scaffolding structure that creates really resilient and beautiful skin. But when the sugar sticks to it, it disrupts the collagen molecules and essentially caves in that scaffolding structure. And this is the sugar, but it's also, like you're describing, these kinds of advanced end products that are reactive and really just create destruction and havoc around them. And so in the case of collagen, you get that scaffolding structure just collapsing in on itself. And that's actually where you see wrinkles, essentially. And interestingly, or I guess importantly to note, is that there's also been research looking at changing diet and healing blood sugar, and that can restore collagen in time. So it's not a forever issue if you make changes. But the reason I like that example is because it's easier to visualize, I think, and feel the impact of high blood sugar and these reactive oxygen species creating wrinkles. But the reality is that is an external process that's visible, that's being mirrored by tons of other internal processes. It's happening in blood vessel walls. It's happening throughout the body. And so I think we're much more conscious of things we can see, but it's a really good example of just the types of damage that's happening inside the body. And again, the opportunity we have to reverse that.
Love that. Yeah, that's super helpful and a really great analogy. So I do have a few questions sort of related to a CGM. So a lot of people, their blood sugar naturally goes down at night, but some people, their blood sugar goes high at night. And I was wondering if you had any insight on these high blood sugar levels in the evening time.
My instinct on that would be, it depends what they're eating at night. I think people tend to do a lot more snacking at night than they think. And this is actually backed up by some research. I was recently learning about a study that essentially asked people to estimate their fasting window at night. And on average, people estimated it to be 2 hours longer than it actually was, because they were sneaking food. And I don't mean that as a judgmental word, but they were essentially eating food after they had started their fast. But they weren't accounting for it. So I think if someone's seeing high blood sugar levels, my go-to would be to really look at what's being consumed leading up to bedtime. I think something that's interesting is that as we get towards bedtime and we release melatonin is actually linked to insulin resistance. So as we do get more tired, as it becomes dark outside and our bodies get ready for sleep, we actually become less resistant to carbs and sugar. So that means that even if we are eating
We
things
become
that
more or less resistant to carbs.
less resistant, sorry, more insulin resistant, but less resistant. So we're less able to process carbs.
Okay,
So
got
we're
it.
likely to see, so we're likely to see higher blood sugar from things that maybe if we had eaten earlier, wouldn't have spiked our blood sugar. And really generally, it looks like for most non-diabetics, we have the best ability to process carbs around mid-morning. So and then it goes downhill. So by the time you get to almost being ready to sleep, your body is really not in a good situation for food. And in addition to the fact that melatonin makes us less insulin sensitive, also, as we get near bedtime, the internal clock that's telling us to sleep is very confused if our gut then receives food, and we have peripheral clocks telling us now that we're eating. So that also creates a lot of dysregulation. So that's a long way of saying, I think often when people are seeing high blood sugar at night, it has to do with food choices leading up to bedtime. And to know that we might be more sensitive than we think during that time.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were done.
Go ahead.
No, there's such great an important point is that when we eat, we didn't talk about that yet. And that's a perfect sort of answer for that, because when we eat really has a huge impact on what our blood sugar levels are doing. And it's often driven by our resistance or sensitivity to insulin. And so, one time I had ice cream in the afternoon, and I was walking around after almost nothing on the CGM. And then one time I had ice cream after dinner at night by itself. My blood sugar was elevated for so long. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is just not clearing, And so you can do those types of experiments and see the difference that it has. And like you said, our body's not ready for food at night. It's ready to start detoxifying in our sleep. It's not ready to digest. It doesn't have all those faculties sort of at the ready. And so another great reminder to eat, well before bedtime for optimal glucose and insulin regulation. So another big question I have is alcohol. So I had someone say, my fasting blood glucose usually runs a little high, like a little bit around 100, but I had alcohol. And then the next day, my blood glucose was lower. It was like 90. So should I drink alcohol? Like, what is happening here? And, why is this not a green light for drinking alcohol?
A lot of people observe that. And this actually comes up a lot in our levels community groups where people notice that. And they actually, like you're saying, they actually wonder if it's a tool that can be used, kind of like some people use apple cider vinegar, that they could use alcohol to stabilize things. And the answer is, it's not a good idea. And the reason is because, for one, I think there's a lot of increasing information coming out about the potential harm from alcohol. And again, I tend to be moderate in terms of how I like to live and talk about these things with my friends and family, because I do think it's about feeling our most alive, and it's not about restriction and rules. But I do think that the science supports that alcohol is not healthy for our bodies, even in relatively small amounts. So that alone, I think, is a reason not to use alcohol as a tool. Not to mention, of course, the challenges with alcohol in excess that we all know about. In terms of metabolic health, the reason that it is lowering blood sugar is actually because it's disrupting the normal process of the liver. The liver is a very complex organ in that it can help the body store glucose and blood sugar, but it also can create glucose and blood sugar. And so it's creating a lot of the balance in the body that we see in order to do all the things we do. I mean, it's kind of amazing, for example, that we can go overnight without eating and our blood sugar is stable. I mean, that is the work of the liver and other body systems, but it shows how much regulation is required to just keep us going and alive day to day. Alcohol interrupts that. And so actually what we're seeing is a disrupted ability to create that blood sugar balance and to process the blood sugar that we're eating, and if need be, to create new blood sugar to stabilize lows. So it's really the end result is people see their blood sugar falling, but it's not a very sustainable way, I think is the best way of putting it, to manage blood sugar.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because it is definitely not a good idea. And I work with a lot of people who have reactive hypoglycemia, and this would be a really poor combination because it can drive those levels low. And in my own life, the only time I've really ever woken up with my heart pounding out of its chest in the middle of the night was after drinking alcohol. And that is giving that sort of, the body is not able to, is it that it blocks glucagon production?
I think it's actually has multiple impacts, including an impact on gluconeogenesis and also in the processing of blood sugar and fructose, where essentially alcohol gets the priority in the liver's work for that time period. And so its ability to work with sugar is just put on the back burner. And so really the way I think of it is almost alcohol is stealing the attention of the liver. And it's doing that because alcohol is toxic. And so our bodies know that we have to process alcohol in order to continue living. So it has to have priority, but that is not a situation we want to be in.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, as I was saying that with reactive hypoglycemia, people who struggle tend towards this hypoglycemia, these low blood sugar numbers, that alcohol can really drive that. And that waking up in the middle of the night with a pounding heart is a common symptom that I see in my clients with reactive hypoglycemia. And oftentimes that is due to the adrenal issues that they're experiencing. But those are a bunch of stress hormones being like, hey, your blood sugar is going dangerously low. It pumps you with adrenaline and which is epinephrine, which creates the new blood sugar. But now you wake up and your heart is pounding. So if you find that happening, that's due to a blood sugar low from the alcohol, or if you haven't drank alcohol, it's due to other factors. But yeah, I think that's super interesting and definitely important to know.
Yeah, it really is. And I think we've all experienced what you're describing. And in addition to what you're describing in terms of the stress response, also just the interrupted sleep is another challenge. And like I said, I think this idea that just because our monitors aren't reading the blood sugar doesn't mean that our bodies aren't working really hard to try to be resilient to that intake. And I mean, it's actually interesting because I think sometimes people ask, well, if the goal is just to keep blood sugar stable, for example, I could drink oil. If I just drank oil all day, my blood sugar would be stable, right? Or like to your point, well, I could just drink alcohol. And so this is where I think it becomes really important that everyone think about the number one goal is to nourish our bodies. The number one goal is to create a nutritional foundation for essentially having good metabolic health, but even more importantly, feeling the way we want to feel in our bodies, feeling the most alive that we can and the most in balance and the most able to experience our life. And so doing all that and having stable blood sugar is amazing, but stable blood sugar in and of itself is not the only goal. The goal is much larger than that.
I'm glad you brought that up. And I think that now that we can track our blood sugar so easily, what I'm finding is that sometimes we are sort of overcorrecting and we might think, oh my goodness, my blood sugar went up. Like we're expecting this flat line. And I always say, if you have a flat line on your CGM, you're dead. So we definitely don't want that. There's going to be some normal fluctuations. And this is part of the normal process. We want to have some sort of movement sometimes. And we want to have this good regulation of the blood glucose where it doesn't spike too high and it doesn't stay up too long. But we don't want a flat line. We don't want to aim for a flat line. And we also don't want to say, oh, if I just eat, a block of butter and oil, like all day, I'm going to have this great, glucose curve. But again, we have to focus on nutrients first and foremost, because our body runs on nutrients. And then we just don't want to overdo all the nutrients from sort of a glucose standpoint. And we're going to be much better off because not only macronutrients, but micronutrients, these vitamins and minerals play a huge role in regulating our metabolism and metabolic health. So I wanted to ask if there are any misconceptions sort of that are jumping out at you in terms of food or like just common knowledge. Like you mentioned the oatmeal at first, and I'm so glad you brought that up. I have a whole post on why oat milk is terrible. It went sort of viral, and I got a lot of people were unhappy hearing that oat milk wasn't a good choice for your blood sugar. So maybe what foods sort of have been touted with this like health halo, and they're really kind of a disaster that we see for the majority of people on a CGM and for their blood glucose?
There's some that aren't too surprising. For example, almost all cereals are going to spike blood sugar. I mean, it's almost impossible to find a cereal in a package that is going to be good for metabolic health. And that's both because of all the added sugar. It's also just because of the carb loads. And I think oatmeal is a good example of that. Oatmeal might not have added sugar. It has natural sugar, but also the overall carb load is just more than most of us can tolerate in a single serving. And many people, especially when it comes to cereal, are not eating a single serving. They're filling a bowl. That's what I always used to do. So I was part of this, and it's amazing. It's delicious. It feels really good. And I think a lot of cereals are designed to be addictive. So you actually finish that bowl and you want another bowl. And on top of that, you're probably drinking it with milk. And whether that's dairy or that's oat milk or whatever it is, it might also have added sugar in there. And so now you're in a situation where you have two things happening at once. And then some people also add fruit or dried fruit. And so you can end up with a situation where you have just an immense carb load. So cereal is one that's very difficult. Likewise, yogurt. I mean, almost all yogurts are sweetened. Many yogurts have way more sugar than, for example, a Krispy Kreme donut. And there are ways to look. You have to really read the labels if you want to find unsweetened yogurt. But even the ones that claim to have less sugar still have enough sugar to likely spike people. And dairy itself is a really interesting thing, actually, when it comes to metabolic health, because there's a lot of debate on it. And of course, all dairy has natural sugar in it in the form of lactose. And so there's a lot of debate on essentially the insulin response to that natural sugar and to dairy itself, and the fact that the insulin response tends to be somewhat more than we would expect given the sugar load of the natural sugars. But there's also a whole body of research showing that people who eat dairy tend to be more metabolically healthy than those who do not. And so I think this is an area where there's a lot of debate, but any yogurt that is full of sugar is going to be difficult for metabolic health. And then there's this whole other category of foods that have what I think of as sneaky sugars. So a good example of this is sushi. Sushi rice, first of all, tends to be very high in carbs. Depending on the way the rice is processed, might be very low in fiber. So that in and of itself is going to be difficult for the body. And then on top of that, sushi rice is often sweetened much more than we would think. So you're actually eating sugar rice in the form of sushi. And most people, I think, actually think that eating sushi is a really healthy choice for a dinner out. And so I think there's disconnects there where actually, if someone said, you're going to eat sugar rice, it's going to be difficult for your body, but the person knew it and they made that choice, the same way they would say, well, sometimes I have a piece of cake, right? You're conscious of it. That's a different thing. But I think oftentimes people are actually choosing sushi to be healthier than something else they might actually enjoy more. And meanwhile, they're getting this big glucose spike. So there's a lot of things like that where you just wouldn't think, for example, now I'm very conscious of this because one, I control my blood sugar, but also I have the CGM on and I'm constantly looking, and it is amazing where carbs are hidden. For example, in a lot of the coffee shops, they have egg bites. Like I think Starbucks has them, Pete's has them, and they're egg bites. And you would think they're egg and they're low carb, but many of those are actually made with tons of breadcrumbs baked in there. And so they actually have much higher carb loads than you would think. And I learned this because I had one and my blood sugar spiked really high. And I thought, what is possibly going on? All I had was an egg. And it ends up I didn't have an egg. I had an egg with a lot of carbs. So I think the overall theme here is there's some things where it's pretty clear there's added sugar, and there's a lot of things where we just have to be really, really conscious about reading labels.
Those are great examples. And sushi, I'm glad you brought it up because that is the biggest spike that I've had on my glucose monitor is from sushi. I had another friend who showed me, I mean, huge spikes from the majority of people eating sushi. And especially, there's all those extra things. So it's like the tempura and it's, I don't have that, but it could be much more than just the rice, but the rice itself, because we don't think about it. We're like, oh, it's cooled rice, so it must be better. But for some reason they must use a ton of sugar because it really is such a big spiker. I think for the quantity of rice, I've had other rice that doesn't spike me nearly as much. So yeah, I think that those are really great points. And how Starbucks or whatever, they're diluting, breadcrumbs are cheaper than eggs and probably the cheese that are in there. So they're going to use filler and it will jack up your blood sugar.
Yeah. And it's tasty. People like the way the breadcrumbs taste. And I think that this is actually similar for the sushi, which is one thing that people don't realize is, for example, sauces, dipping sauces, oftentimes really high sugar, seaweed salad, oftentimes really high sugar. And the thing is that we're so used to the flavor of sweetness in our day-to-day lives that we actually don't notice that something is sweet when it just seems average sweetness to us. It's incredible. And this is a much larger discussion around the food industry, but it's very difficult to sometimes know if you're eating a lot of conventional food, that something even has sugar, because you can't even notice it. And this is, I'm sure you deal with this and that you work with your clients on this, but I mean, I think one of the things that is true right now about metabolic health is that often it does mean being kind of the radical friend in your friends group, or the radical family member, simply because the whole system is set up right now to make it very difficult to eat for blood sugar. And I hope it changes, but in the meantime, it does mean if you're choosing to go this path, that you will be the person who goes to a restaurant and is looking at the menu and is asking for things without sauce, or is kind of working around the menu. And my hope is in 10 years, it will be really different. But unfortunately, that's the reality right now.
Yeah, I'm also really glad you brought that up, because it is this radical act nowadays to just eat foods that we were designed to eat as humans and not be poisoned by toxic amounts of sugar and chemicals and vegetable oils in our diet. So it seems like we have to be the crazy ones, but really we're just trying to not eat chemicals and things that make our body weak and sick, right? So yeah. And so if you have time for just one more question, I wanted to ask you how, the Levels, so Levels is a company that provides continuous glucose monitors, and you don't need your doctor's permission. And I believe they have doctors there like you and others to help get you that prescription and get you the device. And so is that right so far?
Yeah, so basically the process, and actually we've just launched a big research study, which we're really excited about. So that's changed the process a little bit. But essentially, when someone joins Levels, they go through a medical consult process, all done virtually, that then allows them to have the CGM shipped directly to their house, and it goes from there. And then, like I said, we just launched a very large IRB approved study that will be the largest study of this type, looking at food logging and blood sugar patterns in non-diabetics. And so in the real world, right? So like not in a sterilized clinical trial setting, but just to say, what does healthy blood sugar look like? Or what are the patterns we see? For example, some of these early things around sushi rice and around other things, ultimately, we want to be able to say, okay, we know that these are the patterns that happen with these types of foods. And we know that this happens in the morning for some people. And you can imagine all kinds of personalization happening from this, but we have to start by learning and really changing paradigm to say blood sugar matters for everybody. So as part of that, we've also changed a little bit of the process for getting CGMs, but whatever route people take, it's completely seamless is our hope, in the sense that you just get started, it shows up at your door, and you start on the app.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that detail. And in terms of the app, so yes, you get a device, but you also get the Levels app. And so what are some benefits of having this app versus just, if you got, like a device on your own or something like that?
We're really excited about this. We've been working really hard on adding more and more to the app, but essentially you can think of it as a guided journey that you have, where we're taking the raw data from your CGM and we're creating it into recommendations and insights. So for example, some of the things that the app does is after you eat a meal, it will tell you how well that meal scored, and then it will remind you of that later. So for example, at the end of a day or at the end of the week, you can go and see which meals worked for you and which didn't. Or for example, if a meal didn't work for you, let's say you had a large blood sugar spike, the app will suggest a swap. It might say something like, we noticed you had a spike, maybe try eggs for breakfast tomorrow, or something like that. We're working on all kinds of things to make it just as easy as possible for people to really understand their own health and also make changes. Because like we said at the beginning, this is actually a perfect loop back, which is that ultimately our goal is that everyone has the power over their own health. And we want everyone to feel like they're not being told to do this or that. They understand what there's happening in their body, and they are making the choices, and they're knowing their body better than anyone else. So really the goal of the app is to help people along that journey and to give them the education, the guidance, the awareness, and the motivation and the fun of doing something like this, because it's really rewarding. The way that I feel now that my blood sugar is stable versus how I felt back at that pre-diabetes diagnosis, it's not even comparable. I just feel like I'm really alive now, which sounds kind of dramatic, but I think when you're on a blood sugar roller coaster, so much, at least for me, of my day was spent either thinking about the next sugary thing I was going to eat and find, or coming off a high or a low from the blood sugar, from the sugary thing I just ate. and just constantly being in this cycle of kind of like highs and then crashes and highs and crashes and wondering what's coming next. And now I don't have that anymore. And it's really liberating. And I just love it. So part of the app is just helping people find that place where it's self-reinforcing.
Love that. And one of my personal favorite features of the Levels app was that it told you if you had a meal that had a spike, it told you how many points that meal spiked you. So it would be like that meal spiked you by, 27 points or something. And so it helps you to sort of quantify as well if you're someone who likes those numbers, and just to, if you're keeping track of things, it's like, wow, I'm having these spikes that are like 50, 60, around there. And then all of a sudden you have this data and you're like, oh, I'm only spiking in the 20s and 30s. So you have even more data, because sometimes it's hard to quantify all these things. Like you're saying, we're doing research studies, like what is normal? There's not full parameters of what is normal, what is ideal. Like we have some ideas, but again, oftentimes measuring this against yourself is really helpful. So it's like, what are these tweaks that we can do? Like, oh, when I went for a walk after that meal, I didn't have a spike. It didn't alert me. So, you know that these are good practices for you. So it's like you sort of design it. It's like this thing on your arm that helps you design this lifestyle that sort of gives you that in real-time feedback on what you're doing, and if that was a positive thing for you or negative. And yeah, really, really helpful. And I will forever love CGMs and be promoting them as something to really, really help people find that place of that freedom from these blood sugar roller coasters that we often find ourselves on, as just by eating the normal foods that we're exposed to and that they sell out there. So this isn't our fault, but we have to take that radical act of figuring this out, slapping these things on our arms and figuring out what works for us. And it really does accelerate your progress as well in every area of health.
It does. And even small changes make a big difference. So I think it's really empowering. And I so appreciate you doing the work that you do and getting the word out there and just helping people find their health, because it really is life altering.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise. It's been so lovely. I feel like we could talk probably forever about blood sugar stuff, but where can people go if I do have a link as well, but where can people go if they want a CGM?
They can go to levels.com. And we also are on Instagram at Levels. There's tons and tons of information also on our blog, which you can access through our website. And then I also post sugar related little things like going into grocery stores and checking out what's there. And my Instagram is at Dr. Kelley-Chew.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. The blog is awesome. I have been on there. It's like, I've never really liked a blog so much. I feel like blog is very like, oh, early 2000s, but it's such a wealth of information. So definitely check that out. And then I have a link that I'll put in the show notes for if you wanted to get a CGM from Levels. It has like my name attached to it or something like that. And and if you do have one, send screenshots and let us know how you're liking the app and what you learn about your health. So I love hearing that feedback of all these aha moments that people have. So thanks again for coming on the show, and we'll have to have you back on soon.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.